Hi, hello, it's Sugar. Welcome to my normal and heroic guide for the Jailer. This is a 3-phase encounter. Transitioning into a new phase is not percent based. When the boss dominates all pylons in phase 1, he then transitions into phase 2. In phase 2, the tanks must use an ability on the pylons to prevent them from forming a line to the center. The longer you can do that, the longer you can stay in phase 2. When the pylons do make a line to the center, phase 3 happens, and it's a DPS race to save Azeroth. Hero can be used on pull or in phase 3 when the raid has gained Boon of Azeroth. The raid should stay nearish to the melee anytime there's not a mechanic that requires spreading or running out. In phase 1, the first mechanic we see is Rune of Damnation. This marks several players with bombs. These players need to jump into an unactivated golden pylon chamber to explode. Jump with 2 seconds remaining with your back facing in a way that won't have you thrown off the platform. If any player fails to explode inside the pylon chamber, the raid will take heavy damage and be knocked back. It's important for players to prioritize the pylon chambers near the boss because they are needed to line of sight the next ability, Relentless Domination. The Jailer will dominate any players and pylons in his line of sight. The raid should all quickly move behind an activated pylon. After the cast finishes, any pylons that were activated disappear. If anyone fails to LOS this ability, they become mind-controlled by the Jailer with Domination, increasing their HP by 500% and damage by 200%. This makes them very hard to kill. In Heroic, dominated pylons will cast Tyranny, launching an orb at several players. There will be grayish lines connecting to the player. Everyone should move out of its path to avoid the damage and dot it applies. Next, we have the tank combo for this phase, Martyrdom. Tanks will want to make sure they are in a good position for this, as Imprisonment will root the tank in place on the first hit. Persecution will then inflict heavy physical damage and leave a dot behind, increasing physical damage taken by 500% for 40 seconds. Suffering then applies a raid-wide bleed for 21 seconds, and finally, Misery hits the tank for more physical damage, split among all players in 10 yards, also knocking them back. To counter this, the tank should use a defensive on Persecution, and the raid should stack up with the tank for Misery. Watch your positioning for this, as you can be knocked sideways or backwards into unactivated pylon chambers. If less than 5 people soak, the raid will take fatal damage. After this finishes, the tank should taunt swap the boss. Healers may need to use a healing CD here. Shortly after this, Chains of Oppression is cast, pulling all players into the Jailer and chaining them to him. Players should run away from the Jailer to break the chain and reduce the damage done by oppression. Lastly, a mechanic that happens frequently throughout all phases is Torment. This puts a 5.5 yard circle around players and does damage to anyone within it. The raid should spread out to counter this. Once all pylons have disappeared, phase 2 begins. Unholy Attunement will raise pylons around the room, dealing a burst of damage on the raid with Unholy Eruption. These pylons are surrounded by unholy ground that radiates damage to nearby players and spreads over time. Tanks will need to use the Shattering Blast debuff to destroy the pylons. The goal is to prevent 3 pylons from connecting to the center for as long as possible. When targeted by the debuff, run to an active pylon and wait until the projectile hits you. If the tank moves before the projectile hits, the pylon will not be destroyed. Move the boss as needed between sets of pylons so the tanks can easily reach them. Pre-positioning will be key for tanks with less mobility. The bombs are replaced by Rune of Compulsion in this phase. The Jailer will mark several players, and upon expiration they become hostile and gain a shield. These players are then compelled to walk off the edge of the platform. The raid should stack up in melee before this is cast and then quickly DPS out affected players. Decimator impacts an area of the platform with a large blue swirly circle that deals raid-wide damage to those outside of it, applies a 21-second dot, and does a knockback. The raid should not be in the circle and ensure they won't be knocked off the platform. Torment will now leave behind a tormenting echo zone at the player's location that explodes after 2 seconds. Spread out and make sure not to trap your friends. When 3 pylons form a line to the center, phase 3 begins. Boon of Azeroth will be applied to the raid, increasing mastery by 14, and crit haste and versatility by 10%. Torment and Decimator remain active in this phase. In Heroic, Torment will now spawn Incarnation of Torment adds at the location of Tormenting Echoes. These adds cast Cry of Loathing that deals raid-wide AoE and decreases players' haste by 10%. This can stack. These adds are a priority target and should be CC'd, interrupted, and burned down as quickly as possible. Chains of Anguish will shackle players to the tank. These need to be broken. They can be staggered, or the tank can jump away and break them all at once. The method of breaking them will depend on whether or not your healers have a healing CD available for it. The Jailer will face Azeroth and cast Desolation, reducing Azeroth's life force by up to 20%. The raid should stack in this line to reduce the damage, and healers should use a healing CD here. The rune mechanic changes into Rune of Domination in this phase, marking several players with an 8-yard bluish circle. These players should step out of the stack group, and the rest of the raid should split up and stack with each player. Dominating Will applies a healing absorb shield divided evenly amongst those hit. Everyone should then stack back up in melee, and healers should use a healing CD to remove the absorb. If it's not removed before it expires, Domination will be applied to players. This is the same MC we saw in Phase 1 when failing to line of sight. The Jailer will cast Defile in a part of the room, creating a pool that deals damage and increases in size when players stand in it. This can cover the entire platform very quickly. The raid needs to move out as soon as possible, and the boss should be moved away from the pool to ensure no one is accidentally knocked into it. That's all the mechanics. Here's our final TLDR for this raid. Phase 1 ends when the Jailer has dominated all pylons. Relentless Domination equals line of sight. Rune of Damnation equals a bomb, jump into a pylon chamber at 2 seconds. Martyrdom combo. Tanks use a defensive, and raid soaks with the tank. Chains equals runaway. Torment equals spread. Phase 2, prolong by preventing 3 pylons in a row. Tanks use Unholy Attunement to destroy pylons. Rune of Compulsion equals stack in melee and DPS the player down. Decimator equals dodge. Tormenting Echo equals spread and then dodge. Phase 3, hero if not used on pull. Desolation of Azeroth equals soak plus healing CD. Rune of Domination equals stack in groups with each player, then run back into melee and use a healing CD. Chains of Anguish equals stagger breaking, or have tank jump away to break all at once. Defile equals stay out of pools or they grow. In Heroic, Incarnation of Torment adds equals CC, interrupt, and nuke. And finally, dodge any falling debris. I hope this boss guide helps you and your team defeat this raid, and thank you to my team's tank, PJ, for the clips of the tank mechanic. I'll leave his socials down below. Okay, bye!